and whatnot, but there's an air here that Arteta and Edu are willing to be patient. They're not going to go rush out and buy someone. They want someone who comes into this team who's ready to play.
Yeah, definitely. I think Arsenal's recruitment will be, and I'm not just talking immediately, but generally and going forward, there will obviously be a focus on the youth academy. We've talked about that on these podcasts before. I think there's going to be some investment to try and bring in better quality players at a younger age and really compete with rivals like a Chelsea, a Tottenham, in London in particular, to get hold of some of the country's best talent. And then at senior level, I do think they're in a phase of their journey where you're bringing in players to deliver now. We saw that with Declan Rice. You don't spend that sort of money on such a quality player because you want him to develop at your club solely. Of course they want him to develop at their club, but they want him to deliver now. Gabriel Jesus, Alexander Zinchenko. In most positions you look at, David Raya, it wasn't, we're going to bring in a Rasmus Højlund, who Manchester United, despite the price tag, bought in as a developmental striker. They also wanted a more senior one, and that may come next at Old Trafford. They bought in at Arsenal Kai Havertz to deliver now. So I think for the first team that will continue, and some of the striker targets we're talking about, and we have on this pod before, the likes of Sesko and Gokaresh, yeah, they are quite young, but they are pretty experienced already for club and at international level too. We talked a bit about an Evan Ferguson, but yeah, he is more developmental, and I don't think that's one that's going to materialise for Arsenal at this particular time, largely because of the price tag and he's not had a great season. But if you are going to pay that sort of money, even for an Evan Ferguson, it's to deliver now, and all the other strikers that have been linked with, the same would apply. Then you go into that sort of midfielder bracket. You know, somebody I think of off the top of my head that Arsenal and other clubs really like is Bruno Guimaraes. He can play in the 8 and the 6. Newcastle will hope to keep hold of him. There is a release clause though. Anyone who's going to take him, he's got to deliver straight away. Arsenal may be looking, and I think James McNicholas wrote about this, to bring in a left back. That left back won't be to try and be the successor in 5 years' time, maybe like they did with Nuno Tavares, although that didn't really work out, or Sambi Lokonga in central midfield, where it was kind of experimental. And if they do come to the boil fruition, fantastic. If they don't, we'll look to trade elsewhere with the hope that their valuation has increased. And so I do see that continuing, and Arsenal are in a phase now where, despite what we saw largely towards the end of the Wenger reign, which was largely related to the finances at his disposal and the stadium move, etc., and Arsenal's wish that financial fair play was going to be the solution to cure all ills and it was going to level the playing field, now they're kind of in here and now mode. The Cronkies, the owners, have backed them in the market. We've got no evidence to suggest they won't continue to do so. Yes, they have to comply with the PSR rules. Yes, they've been close to the line on that, but that's going to be changing from the 25 to 26 season, in that you've got to spend a percentage of your revenue. If Arsenal can continue to up their revenues, then they'll be among the clubs that will have some significant resources at their disposal to spend. And so I'd be quite excited by that if I was an Arsenal fan, because their record in the transfer market of late has been pretty good. But it's important for fans, all of us, the public, nobody seems to like this word, to be patient. You know, they've built progressively, quite impressively in the market. You can scrutinise each individual all you like, but I see an Arsenal that at the moment they brought those in, they've contributed. There haven't been many failures. I think Fabio Vieira is one that hasn't succeeded so far, but we know there's a player there and they will like to think they can still get more out of him. Therefore, Edu and the recruitment team and Arteta, I think, deserve the credit to continue to build in these windows. But they do need to get it right, because I keep coming back to the competition from their rivals. And when I say like a Bruno or Sesko or whoever, these are just names that are kind of in the environment. You're going to be in a fight for them, and finances will play a part. But Arsenal have done well at delivering the players that Mikel Arteta wants, or if they've missed out on their first choice, like they missed out on Lisandro Martinez, the alternative has been pretty good in the form of Zinchenko. Jurrien Timber was a brilliant signing, and it was so cruel that he suffered the ACL, but there's high hopes that he will come back and deliver. So I actually see Arsenal being a stronger, a more mature squad, but one that will look very different because of the amount of outs that I think need to happen, and therefore there will be some ins as well.
I want to touch on the outs in just a second, but super quickly in terms of the ins, Art, I guess bringing people in like Kai Havertz or even Ben White, who I think was brought in as a centre-back, it's interesting that actually the positions they're playing now in this squad aren't necessarily the positions that they were envisaged to play as well.
Yeah, I think there's two main pillars with Arsenal's recruitment strategy over the past few years. The first one, as David spoke about, is age profile, which I think when they started to get that right was when in 2021 they recruited 6 players under the age of 23 with the view to have them grow with the squad. It's worked with some players like Martin Ødegaard, Takahiro Tomiyasu and Aaron Ramsdale. It's not worked with the others like Nuno Tavares and Sambi Lokonga. Then they kind of moved on from that thinking age-wise and went a bit older, say mid-20s with Gabriel Jesus and Zinchenko, but not too old to the fact where they couldn't have a proper impact on the team. So it was mid-20s players who had good experience. You saw it again with Declan Rice this summer. The other pillar is signing players based off their attributes rather than just a position they can play. So as you said, with Ben White, that came in handy because when Saliba came back from loan in Marseille and clicked with Gabriel, which Mikel Arteta was actually surprised by, it then became easier to move Ben White to right back, where he's been ever since, and he's arguably been one of the best right backs in the Premier League. With Kai Havertz, I think it's a bit more difficult because obviously he was brought in as a midfielder. That was what Arsenal almost said he was at the start, and that's what Mikel Arteta tried to do. And it wasn't until 5 months into his time at Arsenal that he was being used more often as a centre forward, and when it clicked. I don't think Arsenal can really afford to give players 5 months to click, and that's where David mentions needing people who are ready to make an impact right now going forward. So I think those two kind of pillars are what will be the main ones they look at going into this summer. And if you can find someone like a Jurrien Timber who can play across the whole backline and do it extremely well, if you can find that in areas further forward, then you're looking at actually improving the team and the depth that we spoke about before.
This is the Athletic FC podcast with Ayo Akinwolere.
David, let's move on to outgoings, and I guess sales. You touched on it earlier, and we've spoken about the likes of Emile Smith-Rowe, Eddie Nketiah, who's not played much football this season at all, especially from the academy standpoint. And you talked about PSR earlier. They represent pure profit. Do we see any of those players heading out? I mean, let's not even talk about Aaron Ramsdale as well, based on what we've seen this season.
Yeah, you turning this conversation to outs reminds me that it was also not so long ago that Arsenal were cleaning that dressing room, and they took some pain when the likes of Arseal and Sokratis and Mustafi and Kolasinac and later Aubameyang, you can debate this freely about whether they should have gone, whether Arsenal are weaker without an Aubameyang and Arseal, etc., etc. That's all history now. But their aim was to sort the dressing room out, sort the wage bill out. And when you see everybody's financial accounts being published recently, Arsenal have done good work on the salaries, and that should not be sniffed at. That's a really important factor in this. Many people know in football it's not so much about the transfer fees these days, it's about the salaries. That really affects your costs, and will be a massive factor in the new squad cost controls with UEFA and the Premier League. Furthermore, on the agents' fees paid, there are teams that are way above them, the likes of Manchester City, Chelsea, Manchester United. Liverpool. So some credit to them on that. When it comes to the outs now, they really do have an opportunity to raise significant funds. In terms of the personnel, maybe we'll start from the back. Aaron Ramsdale, I would expect to leave because he needs and wants to be playing football. It's a real shame, but that's how it works out sometimes. And David Raya is the clear number one. Whatever Mikel Arteta said at the start, it appears that that was always his plan. He wanted to sign Raya before Ramsdale actually came to the club. And eventually it came to fruition. Arsenal need to turn the Raya transfer permanent. And Ramsdale, whether he leaves on a permanent basis or on loan, I assume will be heading out of the club, and they'll need to bring in a backup goalkeeper. There are big question marks over Zinchenko purely for the fact that you would normally be negotiating a new contract now if you're in his position, and I'm not aware of any talks taking place. So that situation will have to be addressed. He clearly isn't the regular starter by virtue of injury and selection that he was when he joined. Last summer, unexpectedly, there was a lot of speculation around Gabriel and interest from the Saudi Pro League. Is something like that going to come again? Unexpectedly. I think Arsenal would hope to keep hold of him, and I don't know of any developing situation right now, but I didn't this time last year. And if somebody like that left, you'd have to look to bring in a replacement. When you move into midfield, there are clear questions that need to be answered around Thomas Partey, who is approaching the final year of his contract. He barely plays for Arsenal anymore. He seems to be fit now, but is not really getting on the pitch and is not influencing. We know how good he can be, but recent times have not worked out how everybody would hope. I don't imagine he'll be getting a new contract, so do you sell or do you retain him as a player and you see that value in the final year as being better than a transfer fee? Jorginho, we know there's an option to extend the deal that expires this summer. Do Arsenal want to do that? I think they probably would from a footballing and leadership perspective. Does he want to do that? That's a really big question. You got Declan Rice there. If they need to bring in a number 6, Arsenal, we know, really like Martin Zubimendi. At Real Sociedad, I'm sure other clubs do as well. There's a release clause there. Is he going to want to leave at all? They'll have other options too. You move a bit further forward and there are major questions about the future of Emile Smith Rowe. If he is to leave, it would represent pure profit. The way his trajectory has gone since really signing that new contract and being given the number 10 shirt indicates that all parties may be open to a move, and there will definitely be interest in him. Reiss Nelson would represent pure profit too. There's always an element of interest in him. He decided to sign a new contract, but if he decides that it's time to go and play regular starting football elsewhere, then I could see a move developing. And then you come up to the front line, and that's really interesting because Eddie Nketiah, I think the minutes that he's receiving speak volumes. Maybe Mikel Arteta and Arsenal don't see him as one for them going forward. Some clubs or managers would then try and play them to put them in the shop window, but again, another big contract that was signed, and I know of clubs that like him too, yet he'll have a decision to make as well as Arsenal. And Gabriel Jesus, has time moved past him at Arsenal because he's been suffering from this recurring knee injury or multiple injuries? His goal output is not what he would expect or Arsenal would expect, and we know he's capable of. There's those amazing moments like Manchester United at home this season, but they've become so infrequent that if Arsenal are going to be bringing in a top level striker, you do imagine that they would have to at least consider any outside interest in Gabriel Jesus, even if it doesn't materialise, even if he gets fit and shows his versatility because he can also play wide. But these are serious questions that need to be answered, and what I've presented there as a whole is a squad that has a lot of value and there is potentially a lot of movement to come. I didn't mention Kivior. He's one who until recently I would have said maybe there could be a move there. It hasn't quite worked out yet. Then he established himself in the team, but since that torrid first half against Bayern Munich, maybe there's a bit of reality check there as well. So Arsenal have to be, clearly, when you look at all of that, one of the busier clubs in this summer transfer window in both the ins department and certainly outs.
Yeah, I mean, when we spoke about Tomiyasu, he only signed a 2-year deal, so, that's a really fascinating one to keep an eye on. Arts, very quickly, Jordan Campbell wrote about the likes of Zinchenko and Jesus and the Arsenal train moving so fast that if you do suffer with injury, and you're not as consistent, that actually, maybe the trainer's pulled off and you're almost surplus to requirements. But I also look at all those names that David just spoken about. Arsenal haven't been that great at making profit from selling players. All the players that have gone in terms of, you look at Ozil, you look at Aubameyang, I mean, those are termination of contracts to a certain degree as well. Like, they haven't made much money. So, I mean, the impetus has to be bringing money in as well.
Definitely. When you look at the potential outgoings as well, you need to remember they do have players on loan who they couldn't sell permanently last summer. So Kieran Tierney at Real Sociedad, Nuno Tavares at Nottingham Forest, Albert Sambi Lokonga at I thought of Burnley because of Vincent Kompany, but it's Luton Town.
Great shout, yeah.
But I think all these players as well represent, I guess, an opportunity to bring money in too, because they can't really be forgotten about.
Maybe a Charlie Patino.
Yes, him too as well. So there is, I think, a lot of potential there for outgoings, but the big thing as well is actually selling them well. I don't think Arsenal, as you mentioned, I have done that to a degree of, say, Chelsea or Manchester City, where you see them selling sometimes players who haven't made a first team appearance for almost £20 million. Arsenal haven't been able to do that, really. The only example that really springs to mind is Flo Balogun last season, who went to Monaco for around 25 to 30 million pounds/euros, however you want to look at it. So going into this summer, I think that is an area where they really need to improve, because we talk about, I guess, increase in revenue, and yes, transfers are a way to do that, but I'd probably say the main way they've done that is through the Emirates opening up again, and then also this year the money that has come from getting back into the Champions League. And before that, we have to remember they had a season where they were out of Europe, so getting back into the Europa League was actually massive in terms of clawing back some of that revenue too. So I think when you're moving into this summer and summers beyond that, you need to start thinking about it, I guess, more fully in terms of the assets you have. And David mentioned putting these players in the shop window. I think that's also part of that, I guess, squad rotation and giving these players minutes, because this season and in seasons past, they haven't been able to really showcase to clubs what they can do. So when it becomes, I guess, the transfer window, clubs may not be willing to go permanently on them. They go for those loans instead.
Just a tiny point on that, and allied to the fact that there isn't a great deal of money in this PSR influenced market, I could see quite a few of these players going on loan with option or loan with obligation as opposed to permanent sales from Arsenal, and that effectively does what Art says about putting them in the shop window for a season, and then the clubs decide, okay, they're quality, we want to make an offer for them, and we're in a better PSR position under the new squad cost control rules where they've got a little bit more to play with. So yeah, maybe let's not expect some massive raft of sales that brings in hundreds of millions of pounds, but there will definitely be player movement, and you would like to think revenue coming in for them, whether it's now or further down the line. In the meantime, Arsenal really need to work on their young players coming through, as well as Art talking about how tight the group that Arteta has been using is, and how little has been used from the bench, for example. But from the academy, when you talk to people around the club, it's really just Ethan and Miles. So Ethan Nwaneri and Miles Lewis-Skelly. And Ethan Nwaneri has had a little bit of game time. Miles Lewis-Skelly hasn't really. And there seems to be a bit of a vacuum, which is, it may just be cyclical. It may be due to some deficiencies in player development and work in the academy, and the same at all clubs. But when you look at a Liverpool or a Manchester City or a Chelsea or even a Tottenham, who are flush with these players, some are ready, some are not. Arsenal don't really have that in this generation. They do, you may have noticed, have some coming through at an even younger age group, and it's not right to hype up a 14-year-old, but just to say there are really positive feelings around somebody like Max Dowman, and there's a striker as well, Art will remind me of his name, who's been banging in the goals at youth level. And with what I talked about investment too, Arsenal clearly know the value from a footballing and financial perspective if they can increase the amount of players coming through their own system. And if you look at the team and much of what we've talked about today, yes, there's the Bukayo Saka exception, but that's kind of been it in Mikel Arteta's nucleus, if truth be told. And that's something that does need to improve going forward.
Who's the striker up?
That striker's Chido Obi Martin, Danish youth international. I think he's still 16. His birthday is in December, so he turned 17 in December. But when you look, I guess, a little bit above that as well, there are contract situations with Mario Cozier-Dubry and Ruel Walters, who are both very highly rated and helped Arsenal's under-18s get to the FA Youth Cup final last season. And their contract situations haven't been resolved yet. They expire in the summer. So that's, I guess, another part of it where when I mentioned teams or clubs like Chelsea and Manchester City being able to sell players who haven't even made a first team appearance for X million pounds, Arsenal aren't in the same position because these guys are now in the last few months of their contracts. If they stay, that's great. But if not, you risk losing them for a very small fee, mostly compensation. So I think that's another part of the discussion that needs to be kind of looked at, because it's not just about what happens in the first team, but the academy as well, because that has been Arsenal's main source of profit, I'd say, when you look at Balogun, Iwobi, Joe Willock, Emi Martinez as well.